Welcome to today's gripping story, Shattered Roses. It all begins at Riverport International Airport, where Jason Miller, a security officer, notices something unusual: a lone elderly man named Henry, sitting day after day with a bouquet of roses, waiting for someone who never seems to arrive. What starts as a routine observation quickly spirals into a deeper, emotional mystery. Who is Henry waiting for? And why does he believe so strongly in a love that seems too good to be true? As Jason digs deeper into Henry's life, he uncovers a heartbreaking truth that leads to a life-changing confrontation, one that will test the limits of trust, friendship, and the power of hope. But even when the truth shatters everything, there's still a chance for redemption. Before we dive in, don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on how you think this story will end. And if you enjoy stories that explore human connections and second chances, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. Now, let's begin. Jason Miller had worked at Riverport International Airport for 5 years, and while he used to enjoy the fast pace of the job, the novelty had long since worn off. He adjusted the tight collar of his security uniform, glancing at the clock on the far wall. His shift had just begun. It was a typical morning: travelers dragging their wheeled luggage, tired parents trying to corral energetic children, and businessmen in suits rushing past, phones glued to their ears. Jason took a slow breath as he scanned the crowd, looking for anything out of place. He had his routine down to a science: patrol the terminal, handle minor security breaches, direct lost passengers to their gates, and occasionally defuse a tense situation. It was never anything too serious. Most days passed without much incident. Outside of work, Jason's life wasn't much different. He lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of the city, a place that felt too quiet after the long hours spent in the bustling airport. He had friends, sure, but as people aged, connections seemed harder to maintain. Most of his free time was spent visiting his elderly mother, Margaret. Her health had been declining over the last few years, and Jason often found himself worrying about her. She lived alone now, after all. As he passed through the main terminal, he noticed an older man sitting on one of the metal benches near the arrivals gate. The man stood out. He wasn't dressed like most of the weary travelers around him. He wore a tailored brown coat, a beige scarf draped around his neck, and polished leather shoes. In his lap, he held a small bouquet of roses, deep red, but already starting to wilt at the edges. Jason paused, something about the man catching his eye. He was sitting perfectly still, his posture stiff yet dignified, eyes fixed on the large double doors that led from the arrival gates. He looked as if he had been there for a while, maybe hours. Jason watched for a moment longer before turning back to his patrol. The airport was always full of stories like this: people waiting for loved ones to arrive, family reunions after years apart, or tearful goodbyes. He shook his head and continued on his way, not thinking much more about it. But the image of the man with the roses stuck with him throughout the day. By mid-afternoon, Jason had completed his usual rounds and found himself passing through the arrivals terminal again. The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor as the airport filled with its second wave of passengers. As Jason rounded the corner, he spotted the old man still sitting on the bench. The roses in his lap looked even more wilted now, their once vibrant petals curling inward like a defeated memory of something once beautiful. This time Jason decided to approach. "Excuse me, sir," Jason said, keeping his tone light and polite as he stepped up to the bench. "Is there something I can help you with?" The old man looked up, his eyes a pale blue that seemed to shimmer with a mix of anxiety and hope. His face, though lined with age, had a certain dignity, like someone who had seen his fair share of the world but still believed in its goodness. Jason was taken aback by how carefully the man regarded him, as if he was assessing whether Jason was trustworthy before speaking. "Ah, yes," the old man finally said, his voice soft but clear. "I was just wondering if you knew when Flight 441 was coming in. I've been waiting quite some time." Jason blinked, glancing over to the large digital display showing arrival times. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't have access to that kind of information directly, but the arrival board over there should give you the latest updates." He pointed toward the brightly lit screen across the hall. The old man nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on Jason. "Thank you, young man. I'm waiting for someone very special, you see. I wouldn't want to miss her arrival for the world." The tone in his voice, soft, almost reverent, struck something deep in Jason. There was an unspoken layer to the old man's words, a mixture of hope and nervousness that made Jason wonder just how long the man had been waiting. "You're welcome," Jason replied, offering a small smile. "I hope your reunion goes well." The old man returned the smile, though it was faint and strained, as though the weight of time and expectation had already begun to wear on him. As Jason walked away, continuing his patrol, he couldn't help but look back once more at the elderly figure. The man's attention had already returned to the arrival gate, his eyes scanning the faces of every person who emerged, yet always with a flicker of disappointment when none of them were the one he was waiting for. Jason had seen many people wait in the airport before, people waiting for flights that were delayed, or loved ones running late, but something about this man felt different. His presence lingered in Jason's thoughts, much like the scent of the roses he still clutched in his hands. Jason's shift dragged on in its usual rhythm, another set of rounds, another handful of minor security issues, but his mind kept drifting back to the old man. There was something about the scene that gnawed at him, a quiet unease that he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the man's age or the roses, although both played a part. It was the way he sat there, waiting for something that might never come. After his shift ended, Jason decided to swing by his mother's house. He visited Margaret often, but it was the days when she seemed especially lonely that bothered him the most. Her health had been in decline for the past few years, and the house, once filled with laughter and life, now seemed eerily quiet. Jason's father had left when he was young, leaving Margaret to raise him on her own. Now that she was older, Jason found himself wondering how she was really doing, despite her constant assurances that she was fine. Margaret was sitting in her favorite chair when Jason arrived, knitting something that looked like it had been forgotten mid-stitch. She smiled when she saw him, the warmth of her gaze softening the lines of her face. "Jason, honey, what a nice surprise." He bent down to kiss her cheek. "Just thought I'd check in on you." She laughed softly. "Check on me, oh, please. I'm still tougher than I look." Jason chuckled, sitting on the edge of the couch. They chatted about the usual thing, how her garden was faring, the weather, and her favorite TV shows, but his thoughts kept circling back to the old man at the airport. At some point, Margaret must have noticed his distraction because she paused mid-sentence. "You look like you've got something on your mind," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly in that knowing way mothers always seem to have. Jason sighed, leaning back into the couch. "I met someone at work today. An older man, waiting at the airport with a bunch of roses. He said he's waiting for someone special, but something about it feels off." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. He's just waiting. Hours have gone by, and he's still sitting there. I think he's been there for more than a day, just waiting for this person to show up. I don't know if he's been scammed or what, but something about it doesn't sit right with me." Margaret's face softened. "Loneliness can make people hold on to hope, even if it's false. I've seen it happen with some of my friends. They get a call or a letter, some small sign of affection, and it becomes their whole world." Jason nodded, her words making the unease he felt tighten. "Yeah, I think that's what it is." Margaret sighed, setting her knitting down. "It's hard getting old, Jason. People don't talk about it enough. You start to lose the things that make life worth living, the people you love, the things you used to do. And all you want is for someone to show up and remind you that you're still seen, still loved. I know that feeling well." Jason's heart sank a little, hearing the unspoken vulnerability in his mother's voice. He hadn't realized just how deeply loneliness could cut, especially for someone like her, who had always been so strong. "Do you think he's okay?" Margaret asked gently. Jason shook his head. "I'm not sure." That night, Jason found himself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the image of the old man, Henry, sitting in the airport with his bouquet. It was as if the man's anxious hope had seeped into Jason's mind, and now it wouldn't let go. He tossed and turned, replaying their interaction over and over in his head. What if the person Henry was waiting for never showed up? What if this was some cruel trick, and Henry was left sitting there with nothing but a bunch of dead roses? The thought made Jason feel sick. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Jason drifted off into a fitful sleep. His dreams were filled with strange images of empty airports, endless rows of benches, and an old man clutching a withered bouquet, waiting for a plane that never arrived. By the time his alarm went off, Jason felt more exhausted than he had when he'd gone to bed. But as he dressed for work, there was a sense of resolve building inside him. He couldn't let this go not without knowing what was really going on. When Jason arrived at the airport that morning, the first thing he did was make his way to the arrivals hall. His heart raced as he approached the area where Henry had been sitting. Sure enough, there he was, sitting on the same bench, looking even more tired and worn than the day before. The roses in his lap were nearly dead now, their once vibrant red petals curling at the edges. Jason felt a pang of sympathy as he approached. He had to do something, anything, to help this man, even if it meant confronting a harsh reality. "Good morning, sir," Jason said softly as he approached. Henry looked up, his eyes dull with exhaustion, but still holding on to that small flicker of hope. "Good morning, young man. I'm still here, you see. She should be arriving any moment now." Jason sat down beside him, careful not to invade his space. "I can see that. But I have to ask, how long have you been waiting?" Henry hesitated, his brow furrowing. "A day, I suppose. Maybe a bit longer. Time gets a little muddled when you're waiting for someone so important." Jason nodded, his chest tightening. "And this person you're waiting for, do you have a way to contact her? Maybe check if she's okay?" Henry's face faltered for a moment, the hope dimming just slightly. She should be here. Any minute now." Jason's heart broke a little, but he kept his tone calm and kind. "I hope so too, sir. But just in case, let me know if you need anything. My name's Jason, and I'm here to help however I can." As he stood to leave, he glanced back at Henry one last time, feeling the weight of the man's hope resting heavily on his own shoulders. This was no longer a simple matter of curiosity. Now Jason was determined to get to the bottom of what was really going on. Jason couldn't let go of the growing sense of urgency that tugged at his mind. After leaving Henry for the second time, he went back to the security office, but found himself distracted by the memory of the frail old man waiting on the bench. The bouquet of roses, now almost completely wilted, haunted his thoughts, as did the quiet desperation in Henry's voice when he spoke about the woman he was waiting for. His colleague, David Green, noticed Jason's distracted demeanor as they went over their usual morning security protocols. David, a man in his mid-30s with an easygoing personality, had worked alongside Jason for years. "Something on your mind?" David asked, glancing up from the checklist in front of him. Jason hesitated. Part of him didn't want to drag someone else into what might be a personal issue for Henry, but another part of him knew he couldn't handle this alone. "It's this old guy I've seen hanging around in the terminal for a couple of days now," Jason explained. "He's waiting for someone, says she's supposed to be arriving on a flight." David's eyes widened slightly. "Online? Huh. That sounds like it could be trouble." Jason nodded grimly. "Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. I want to help him, but I don't know how to tell him, that he might be in the middle of something dangerous." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're thinking it's a scam?" Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know for sure, but it feels like it." He mentioned sending her money, and the whole situation seems off. "Hez waiting for this flight, but I've been keeping an eye on the boards, and there's no Flight 441, not even an arrival scheduled for it." David looked thoughtful for a moment before he spoke. "Maybe it's time to dig a little deeper. Do a check on any recent reports of online scams targeting older folks. If this guy has been sending money, it's worth looking into."
Jason knew David was right.
He couldn't just sit by and hope the situation resolved itself. If Henry had fallen victim to a scam, the least Jason could do was try to stop it before things got any worse. Later that day, during his break, Jason found a quiet corner in the security office and pulled out his phone. He did a quick search for recent online scams targeting elderly people. The results were staggering, countless stories of older individuals being manipulated into sending money to people they thought they were in love with, only to find out later that the person never existed. His stomach turned as he scrolled through articles and reports, each one painting a grim picture of how widespread the problem was. Scammers would spend months, even years, building trust with their victims, only to prey on their loneliness and hope for companionship. The details of some of these cases sounded eerily similar to Henry's situation: an online relationship, a distant country, and a promise to meet that never seemed to materialize. Jason's chest tightened. He had to do something. Couldn't just let Henry sit there, waiting for someone who would never show up. He closed his phone and headed back out to the terminal. His steps felt heavier as he approached the arrivals hall, where Henry still sat, his posture slightly slouched now. Jason knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but he couldn't stand by and let this continue. When he reached Henry, the old man looked up at him with a faint smile. "Ah, Jason. Good to see you again. I'm still waiting, but I'm sure shall be here soon." Jason sat down next to him, trying to think of the gentlest way to approach the topic. "Mr. Lawson, I wanted to talk to you about something. It's about Emily and the money you've sent her." Henry's smile faltered slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "Yes, what about it? I've been helping her with some expenses. She's been going through a tough time, and, well, you do these things for the people you love." Jason nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I understand, sir. But I've been doing some research, and I think it's important that you know there are people out there who take advantage of that kind of kindness. Scammers. They build relationships with people online, pretend to be someone they're not, and ask for money. And once they get what they want, they disappear." Henry's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You think that's what this is? That I've been scammed?" Jason felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to crush Henry's hope, but the truth needed to come out. "I don't know for sure, but there's no record of Flight 441 arriving. I've checked, and I couldn't find anything. I just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of." For a long moment, Henry didn't say anything. His hands clenched around the wilted roses in his lap, his knuckles turning white. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Emily wouldn't do that to me. We've been talking for 2 years. We've shared everything, our hopes, our dreams. She's not a scammer. She's real." Jason's heart broke at the conviction in Henry's voice. "I believe you care about her, sir. I just want you to be safe." Henry shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "I appreciate your concern, Jason. But I know Emily. She's not like those people you're talking about. She'll be here. You'll see." Jason didn't push any further. He stood up and gave Henry a gentle nod. "I hope you're right, sir. But if you need anything at all, please let me know." As he walked away, Jason felt the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He had tried to warn Henry, but it was clear that the old man wasn't ready to let go of his hope just yet. Over the next few days, Jason couldn't stop thinking about Henry. Each time he passed through the arrivals terminal, he would see the old man sitting on the same bench, still waiting, still clutching the now completely wilted bouquet of roses. Jason knew that Henry was holding on to something that might never come, but how could he help? He had already tried to warn him, but Henry's belief in Emily was unwavering. Jason couldn't just shatter that belief knot without hard proof. One afternoon, while sitting in the break room, Jason was joined by Sarah Bell, another security officer who had been working at the airport for almost as long as he had. Sarah was sharp, with a no-nonsense attitude, but she had a soft spot for people who were struggling. Jason had always admired that about her. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," Sarah said, sliding into the seat across from him. "What's going on?" Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There's this guy, an old man, who's been waiting for days in the terminal. He says he's waiting for a woman he met online, but I'm pretty sure it's a scam." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Online, and he's just sitting there waiting." "Yeah, he's been sending her money too. It all sounds bad, but he's so convinced she's real." I've tried talking to him, but he won't listen. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Sounds like a classic romance scam. People like that, they know how to manipulate emotions. They make their victims feel special, like they're the only one in the world who really understands them.
And then they ask for money.
Jason nodded. That's what I'm worried about. He's already sent her a low this life savings from what he told me. Sarah let out a low whistle. That's tough. But if he doesn't believe it's a scam, there's only so much you can do. People in those situations don't want to believe they're being lied to. It's like admitting that everything they've hoped for was fake. Jason frowned, her words striking a chord. Yeah, that's what I'm struggling with. I don't want to crush him, but I also don't want him to keep waiting for someone who's never going to show up. Sarah tapped her fingers on the table, her gaze distant as she considered the situation. If it were me, I'd try to gather some proof. You said there's no record of the flight. Maybe dig deeper into that. And if you can find anything concrete about the woman he's talking to, that might help. Show him the facts, not just speculation. Jason felt a surge of determination. You're right. He's not going to listen to me unless I have something solid to show him. Sarah smiled, a glint of approval in her eyes. Good. You're doing the right thing, Jason. Just be careful. Scammers like this, they can be dangerous if they think someone's onto them. Jason nodded, already planning his next steps. He wasn't going to give up on Henry not yet. Later that day, during a quiet moment at work, Jason logged onto his computer and began his search. He started with the basics, looking for any record of Emily Rodriguez, the name Henry had mentioned. As he expected, there wasn't much to find. Scammers rarely use their real identities, and this case seemed no different. He searched for any details he could find about similar scams in South America, reading through countless forums and articles detailing how these criminals operated. What he found was troubling. The scams followed the same basic pattern in online relationship that began innocently enough, with the scammer slowly gaining the trust of their victim. Then, as the relationship progressed, they would start asking for money, often claiming they needed it for medical expenses or to travel to meet their victim in person. The stories were heartbreaking, each one a mirror of what Henry was experiencing. Jason's chest tightened as he continued his research. He didn't want to accept that Henry's situation was the same, but all the signs were there. The lack of a flight, the mysterious Emily, the requests for money, it all pointed to the same conclusion. His stomach churned with dread. He knew what he had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. Henry was going to be devastated. As Jason prepared to head back to the terminal, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter how difficult this conversation was going to be, he wouldn't abandon Henry. He couldn't stop the pain that was coming, but he could be there to help him through it. When Jason approached Henry's bench that afternoon, he felt a lump form in his throat. The old man looked even more exhausted than before, his posture slumped, but the hope in his eyes remained as he looked up at Jason. Good afternoon, Jason, Henry said with a tired smile. I think today might be the day. I've been waiting for so long, but I know she's coming. Jason swallowed hard, sitting down next to him. Mr. Lawson, I need to talk to you. It's about Emily and everything you've been waiting for. Henry's smile faded slightly, but he didn't speak. He just looked at Jason, waiting for him to continue. I've been doing some research, Jason said gently, about online scams. There are people out there who pretend to be someone they're not, people who take advantage of kind-hearted individuals, asking for money and making promises they never intend to keep. Henry's face paled, but he remained silent. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. I think Emily might be one of those people, sir. I haven't been able to find any record of her flight, and everything I've found points to this being a scam. For a long, agonizing moment, Henry didn't respond. His eyes flickered with a mixture of emotions, disbelief, sadness, and finally, anger. No, Henry said firmly, his voice shaking slightly. You're wrong. Emily is real. She's not a scammer. She's coming, Jason. I know she is. Jason felt his heart break at the conviction in Henry's voice, but he didn't back down. I hope you're right, sir. I really do. But I think it's important that you consider the possibility. I don't want to see you get hurt. Henry stood up abruptly, the roses falling from his lap and scattering across the floor. His face was flushed with anger, his hands trembling. "You don't understand, Jason. You don't know what it's like to feel this way, to have someone who cares about you. I'm not being scammed. She's real and she's coming. You'll see." Jason stood as well, his voice calm and steady despite the tension in the air. "Mr. Lawson, please. I just want to help." Henry shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I don't need your help, Jason. I need you to believe in her, just like I do." With that, Henry turned and walked away, leaving Jason standing in the terminal, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was over not by a long shot. Jason returned home that evening, feeling the weight of his conversation with Henry pressing heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the look of anger and pain on the old man's face. Henry had trusted him, and Jason had tried to warn him, but it had only pushed Henry further into denial. As he walked into his small, quiet apartment, Jason was greeted by the familiar sound of his phone vibrating against the kitchen counter. It was his mother, Margaret, calling to check in as she often did. Despite his own emotional exhaustion, Jason knew he couldn't ignore her. He answered, trying to inject some energy into his voice. "Hey, Mom," he said, forcing a small smile. "Jason, honey, I haven't heard from you in a couple of days." "Everything all right?" Margaret's voice was filled with concern, as it often was. Jason sat down at the small table in his kitchen, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just been a long week at work." Margaret's voice softened. "You don't sound fine. You've always been good at hiding things, but not from me. What's going on?" Jason sighed, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't sure how much to tell his mother. He didn't want to burden her with his problems, especially when she had enough to worry about. But as the silence stretched between them, he found himself opening up. "There's this man at the airport. His name's Henry Lawson," Jason began, his voice heavy with the weight of the story. "He's been waiting there for days, holding on to this bouquet of roses. He says he's waiting for someone he met online. But I'm pretty sure he's being scammed." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and Jason could picture her sitting in her favorite chair, her face drawn with concern. "Oh, Jason," she said softly, "that sounds awful." "It is," Jason admitted. "I've tried talking to him, tried warning him, but he doesn't believe it. He's convinced this woman is real, that she's coming for him. I don't know what to do." His mother's voice took on a thoughtful tone. "It's hard, Jason. People like Henry, they hold on to hope because they don't want to face the alternative. Loneliness can make you see things that aren't there, believe in things that don't make sense. I've seen it with my own friends. They get phone calls or letters, and they think it's someone reaching out, someone who cares. But often, it's just someone looking to take advantage of them." Jason felt a pang of guilt as he listened to his mother. He knew she was speaking from experience, not that she'd ever been scammed. But the loneliness she felt was something he hadn't fully understood until now. "How do you deal with it, Mom?" Jason asked quietly. "How do you keep going when you feel like you're all alone?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I think it's about finding small things to hold on to. Memories, friendships, even hobbies. You learn to make peace with the quiet, but it's never easy. I'm lucky to have you, Jason. I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have you to check in on me." I think that's why people like Henry cling so tightly to these relationships, even when they don't seem real. They don't want to feel forgotten. Jason's throat tightened as his mother spoke. He had always known Margaret was lonely, but hearing her admit it so openly broke his heart. He had been so focused on Henry's situation that he hadn't considered how similar his mother's life was, waiting for someone, anyone, to make her feel seen and cared for. "He'll come by tomorrow, Mom," Jason said softly, his voice filled with warmth. "We can spend some time together. Maybe I can help out around the house, or we can go for a walk." Margaret's voice brightened. "I'd like that, honey. It's always nice having you around. But don't worry about me too much. Okay, just do what you can for this Henry fellow. He sounds like he needs someone on his side." Jason nodded, though his mother couldn't see him. "Yeah, I'll try." After they hung up, Jason sat in the quiet of his apartment, his mind racing. Margaret was right. Henry needed someone to help him. But how could he get through to a man who had convinced himself that his only source of happiness was real, even when all the signs pointed to a lie? Jason resolved to keep pushing forward. He couldn't abandon Henry, not when the old man was on the verge of losing everything: his money, his hope, his dignity. There had to be a way to protect him, even if it meant taking matters into his own hands. The next day at work, Jason felt a sense of determination he hadn't had before. He wasn't going to let Henry continue to wait in the airport indefinitely, clinging to a fantasy that would never come true. He needed to confront the situation head-on, and if that meant pushing a little harder, then so be it. By the time he reached the arrivals terminal, he saw that Henry was still sitting on the same bench, looking even more tired and worn than before. The roses in his lap were little more than crumpled petals and brittle stems now, their once vibrant beauty completely gone. The sight of them made Jason's chest ache. As Jason approached, Henry looked up at him with a weak smile. "Jason, good to see you again." Still no sign of Emily, but I'm sure she's just delayed. Jason took a deep breath, sitting down next to him. He knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy, but it had to happen. "Mr. Lawson, I need to talk to you again. I know you believe Emily is real, but I've been looking into some things, and am worried." Henry's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "I've checked every flight coming into the airport," Jason continued. "There's no record of Flight 441. It doesn't exist. And I've read about these kinds of scams, people pretending to be someone they're not, building relationships with their victims, and then asking for money. It's exactly what's been happening to you." Henry's hands tightened around the wilted bouquet in his lap, his knuckles white. "You don't understand, Jason. Emily is real. We've been talking for 2 years. She's told me everything about her life, her family, her struggles, her dreams. She wouldn't lie to me." Jason could hear the desperation in Henry's voice, but he didn't back down. "I know you want to believe that, sir. But there are people out there who know exactly how to manipulate emotions. They know what to say to make you trust them. And when they ask for money, they make it sound like it's for something important, like medical treatment or travel. But it's all a lie." Henry's face flushed with anger, and he stood up abruptly, his body shaking with emotion. "I don't want to hear this, Jason. I thought you were my friend. But you're just like the others, trying to take away the one thing I have left." Jason stood as well, his voice calm but firm. "I am your friend, Henry. That's why I'm telling you this. I don't want to see you get hurt." Henry's eyes filled with tears, his chest heaving with the weight of his emotions. "She's all I have. You don't know what it's like to be alone, to have no one. She made me feel alive again, like I wasn't forgotten. And now you're telling me it's all a lie." Jason felt his heart break at the raw vulnerability in Henry's voice. He wished there was another way to protect him, to shield him from the truth. But there wasn't. "I'm sorry, Henry," Jason said softly. "I really am. But I don't want to see you lose everything because of this." For a long, painful moment, Henry just stood there, his face contorted with grief and anger. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Jason standing alone in the terminal, his heart heavy with guilt and sadness. Jason couldn't stop thinking about his confrontation with Henry. He had known it would be difficult, but seeing the old man so devastated had been worse than he had imagined. Still, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on, something that wasn't just about Henry's emotions, but about the people manipulating him. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jason returned to his research, this time focusing on the specific tactics scammers used to string their victims along. He found forums filled with stories from people who had been through similar experiences, stories of false promises, fabricated flight delays, and last-minute requests for more money. It all felt eerily familiar. Jason decided to take things a step further. He knew that scammers often left digital trails, even if they used fake identities. With some help from the airport's IT team, he was able to pull up some of the email addresses and phone numbers Henry had been using to communicate with Emily. What he found only confirmed his suspicions. The email addresses were linked to known scam networks, with complaints from other victims reporting the same patterns: romantic messages, followed by requests for money, all leading to heartbreak when the truth came out. Jason's chest tightened as he read through the reports, each one a mirror of Henry's situation. It wasn't just a scam, it was an organized effort, targeting vulnerable individuals like Henry. And it was about to come to a head. The next day, Jason put his plan into action. He spoke with his supervisor, explaining the situation in detail and requesting permission to set up a sting operation. The goal was simple. They would monitor Henry's communication with Emily and intercept any further attempts to exploit him. If the scammers made contact again, they would be ready. Jason wasn't sure how Henry would react, but he knew he had to try. That afternoon, Jason approached Henry's bench once more, his heart racing. The old man looked even more worn than before, his clothes rumpled and his face pale. The bouquet of roses was gone, replaced by a small, crumpled handkerchief that Henry clutched in his lap. "Mr. Lawson?" Jason said gently, sitting down beside him. "I know things didn't go well last time we talked, but I'm here to help. I think we can stop this from getting any worse, if you're willing to trust me." Henry didn't look up at first, but after a long pause he spoke, his voice hollow. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Jason. Everything feels broken." Jason swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Henry's pain. "I understand. But we can fix this. The people who've been targeting you, they're not going to get away with it. We can catch them." Henry's eyes flickered with a faint glimmer of hope, though it was dulled by exhaustion. "How?" Jason explained the plan, laying out how they would monitor the communications and be ready for when the scammers made their next move. He reassured Henry that he wasn't alone in this, that they could put an end to the lies and betrayal. By the time Jason finished, Henry looked slightly more at ease, though the doubt still lingered in his expression. "You really think this will work?" Jason nodded. "I do. But I need you to trust me, Henry. I know it's hard, but we're going to make sure they don't hurt you anymore." Henry took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "All right, Jason. I'll trust you." That evening, as the airport quieted down and the crowds thinned, Jason and his team set up their surveillance. They monitored Henry's phone and email, waiting for any sign that the scammers were about to make their next move. It didn't take long. Just after sunset, Henry's phone buzzed with a message from Emily. She claimed she had finally arrived in the city, but was stuck at customs and needed money to pay for an unexpected fee. She begged Henry to bring the money to her as soon as possible, promising that they would be together soon. Jason's stomach churned with anger. It was exactly what he had feared, another lie, another manipulation designed to squeeze more money out of Henry. But this time, they were ready. Jason quickly relayed the information to his team, who prepared to move into position. They would follow Henry to the designated meeting spot, where the scammers were likely waiting. Jason felt his heart pound in his chest as the plan came together. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. Henry's hands shook as he read the message from Emily. His heart pounded in his chest, torn between the desperate hope that she was finally here and the gnawing doubt that Jason had planted in his mind. He glanced over at Jason, who was standing nearby, his expression tense but calm. "She says she's here," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's waiting for me." Jason nodded, his voice gentle but firm. "I know, Henry. But this isn't what it seems. We're going to go with you. Make sure you're safe. Just trust me, okay?" Henry looked down at his phone, the screen glowing with the words that had once brought him so much joy. Now, they felt like a cruel mockery of the love he had believed in. With a heavy heart, he nodded. "Okay," he said softly, "I trust you." The plan was set. Henry would go to the meeting spot as instructed, but Jason and his team would follow closely behind, ready to intervene the moment the scammers made their move. Jason couldn't shake the tension in his gut as they made their way to the designated area. Quiet corner of the airport's parking structure, far from the bustling crowds. As they approached, Jason's senses sharpened, scanning the area for any sign of the scammers. The parking structure was dimly lit, the shadows stretching across the concrete like dark fingers. Henry walked ahead, his steps slow and hesitant, his eyes darting nervously around the empty space. Jason's team moved into position, spreading out to cover all possible exits. They couldn't afford to let the scammers slip away. Then, out of the shadows, two figures emerged. A man and a woman, both dressed in plain, nondescript clothing, their faces obscured by baseball caps. They walked toward Henry, their expressions unreadable, but their body language was tense. Jason's heart raced as he watched from a distance, his hand hovering near his radio, ready to give the signal. He could see the moment Henry realized something was wrong, his shoulders tensed, and his eyes widened in confusion. "This isn't Emily," Henry whispered, his voice shaking. Before the scammers could say a word, Jason stepped forward, his voice ringing out with authority. "Stop, Riverport Security! Stay where you are!" The scammers froze, their faces twisting into expressions of panic as they realized they had been caught. Jason's team moved in quickly, surrounding them before they could make a run for it. Henry stood in the middle of the chaos, his hands trembling as he stared at the two people in front of him. The realization hit him like a freight train. Emily wasn't real. She had never been real. Jason approached Henry slowly, his heart aching at the sight of the old man's devastation. "I'm sorry, Henry," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." Henry didn't respond. He just stood there, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The love he had believed in, the hope that had kept him going for 2 long years, had been shattered in an instant. The scammers were led away in handcuffs, their plot foiled, but the damage had already been done. Jason stayed by Henry's side, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. He had done everything he could to protect the old man, but it hadn't been enough to stop the heartbreak. Henry looked up at Jason, his voice barely a whisper. "It was all a lie, wasn't it?" Jason nodded, his throat tight. "I'm afraid so, Henry? But you're not alone. I'm here, and we'll get through this together." Henry's eyes filled with tears, his body trembling as the weight of the betrayal finally sank in. Jason reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. For now, all Jason could do was stand beside him as Henry's world crumbled around him. The next few hours felt like a blur. The scammers had been arrested and were being processed by local authorities, but Jason's focus was entirely on Henry. After the confrontation in the parking structure, Henry had grown quiet, retreating into a shell of shock and despair. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth, and his eyes were filled with a hollow sadness that made Jason's heart ache. As they sat together on a bench back in the terminal, Jason didn't push Henry to talk. He knew that right now, the old man was grappling with the reality that everything he had believed in for the last 2 years had been a lie. The woman he had fallen in love with didn't exist, and the money he had worked his whole life to save was gone. Henry sat with his hands resting on his lap, his fingers nervously twitching. Every now and then, he would glance down at his phone, as if expecting another message from Emily, but there was nothing. Jason stayed by his side, offering quiet support as the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Henry spoke. "How could I have been so stupid?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I gave her everything and it was all a lie." Jason's throat tightened as he heard the raw pain in Henry's voice. He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You weren't stupid, Henry. These people are professionals. They know exactly how to manipulate good people like you. They make you believe in something real, and they prey on your kindness. It's not your fault." Henry shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "But I should have seen it. I should have known better. All those times she asked for money, I just thought I was helping her." Jason could feel Henry's devastation like a physical weight. He wished there was something, anything he could say to make it better. But the truth was, nothing would take away the pain of realizing you had been deceived by someone you thought you loved. "You were trying to help someone you cared about," Jason said softly. "There's nothing wrong with that. You were just doing what any decent person would do." Henry's lips trembled, and he looked down at his hands, wringing them together as if trying to find some comfort in the repetitive motion. I thought she was the one. I thought I had found someone who cared about me." Jason's chest tightened. He understood all too well how powerful that kind of hope could be, especially for someone who had been alone for so long. Henry had clung to the belief that he had found love again, and now that hope had been torn away from him. "I know," Jason said quietly, "and it's okay to feel hurt right now. But you're not alone in this, Henry. You still have people who care about you." Henry glanced up at Jason, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Like who? I don't have anyone left. My wife's been gone for years. My kids, they don't visit anymore. Emily was all I had. Jason felt a pang of sympathy. The isolation Henry felt was palpable, and it reminded Jason of the conversations he had had with his own mother about loneliness. It was a feeling that could consume someone, driving them to seek out any form of connection, even if it wasn't real. "You've got me," Jason said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Henry's face crumpled at those words, and he lowered his head, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. Jason sat beside him, his hand resting on Henry's shoulder, offering silent comfort as the old man wept. It was a long time before Henry finally spoke again. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse from crying. Jason sighed, glancing toward the exit where the authorities had taken the scammers. "Well, the police are handling the scammers. They'll face charges for what they did. And as for your money, we'll do everything we can to help you recover some of it. But I won't lie to you, it's going to take time." Henry nodded, though his expression remained bleak. "I don't care about the money," he said quietly. I just don't know how to move forward from this." "How do you come back from something like this?" Jason didn't have an easy answer for that. He knew that Henry's road to healing would be long and difficult, and it wouldn't be as simple as forgetting what had happened. The emotional scars of betrayal ran deep, and it would take time for Henry to rebuild his sense of trust and hope. "One step at a time," Jason said gently. "Well, take it slow, and you don't have to go through this alone." Henry looked at him with watery eyes, gratitude flickering in the depths of his sorrow. "Thank you, Jason. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jason felt a wave of warmth spread through his chest. In that moment, he knew that despite the pain Henry was feeling, there was still a chance for him to heal. It would take time, but Jason would be there for him every step of the way. The days that followed were difficult. Henry had retreated into himself, barely speaking and often staring blankly at his phone as if waiting for a message that would never come. Jason checked on him daily, visiting him in the small apartment where Henry lived alone. It was a modest place, filled with memories of a life that had once been full of joy and companionship. Old photographs lined the wall, pictures of Henry with his late wife, Elizabeth, their faces alight with love and laughter. There were images of family vacations, of Christmas mornings spent together, and of Henry's children when they were young. But now, those memories seemed like relics of a distant past, overshadowed by the loneliness that had consumed Henry's life since Elizabeth had passed away. Jason couldn't help but feel a deep sadness as he looked around the apartment. It was clear that Henry had once been surrounded by love, but over the years, that love had faded away. His children, busy with their own lives, had drifted apart from him, and the loss of his wife had left a gaping hole in his heart. Jason found Henry sitting by the window, staring out at the street below. His phone sat on the table beside him, the screen dark. The sense of emptiness in the room was palpable. "Hey, Henry," Jason said softly as he entered the room. "How are you feeling today?" Henry didn't look up at first, his gaze fixed on something far away. After a moment, he sighed deeply and turned to face Jason. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I just feel lost." Jason sat down across from him, his heart aching at the sight of the once proud man now so broken. "I get that. And it's okay to feel like that. What you went through, it's a lot to process." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears again. "It's not just the scam," he said quietly. "It's everything. My life used to be so full of love, full of people. And now, it's just me. I don't even know how I got here." Jason leaned forward, his voice filled with compassion. "You've had a hard life, Henry. Losing your wife, feeling disconnected from your kids, it's a lot for anyone to go through. But that doesn't mean you're alone. You still have people who care about you, and it's never too late to reconnect." Henry shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "My kids don't have time for me anymore. They've got their own lives. I'm just an afterthought." Jason could hear the pain in Henry's voice, the deep sense of abandonment that had driven him to seek out companionship online. He wanted to say something, anything that would ease Henry's pain, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. What Henry needed was action. He needed to feel like he mattered again. What if you called them, Jason suggested gently. Maybe they don't realize how much you're struggling. Sometimes people just need a reminder that you still need them. Henry looked down at his hands, wringing them together. I don't know, he said quietly. It's been so long, I wouldn't even know what to say. Jason smiled softly. You don't have to say much. Just let them know you're thinking of them. Start small. For a long moment, Henry didn't respond. He seemed lost in thought, as if weighing Jason's words carefully. Finally, he nodded, though there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe you're right, he murmured. Maybe it's time. Jason felt a glimmer of hope as he watched Henry consider the possibility of reconnecting with his family. It wasn't going to be easy. There was a lot of emotional distance to bridge, but it was a start. And that was all Jason could hope for right now. The following week, Jason accompanied Henry to a meeting with local investigators about the scam. It was a formal process, one that required Henry to relive the painful details of his ordeal, recounting how he had met Emily online, how their relationship had developed over 2 years, and how he had sent her his entire life savings, believing he was helping someone he loved. It was hard for Henry to talk about, and Jason could see the toll it was taking on him. But he stayed by Henry's side through it all, offering quiet support as the investigators asked their questions. They took Henry's statement, explaining that while they would do their best to recover some of his lost money, it was unlikely that he would ever see most of it again. When the meeting was over, Henry looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. As they left the investigator's office, Jason turned to him, his voice filled with sympathy. I know that wasn't easy, he said softly, but you did the right thing by reporting it. You're helping make sure these people can't hurt anyone else. Henry nodded weakly, though his expression remained bleak. It just feels like I've lost everything, he said quietly. The money, the hope, the love I thought I had. It's all gone. Jason placed a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. You haven't lost everything, Henry. You've still got a lot to live for. And you've got people who care about you, people who want to see you get back on your feet. Henry looked down at the ground, his eyes filled with sorrow. I just don't know how to start over, he murmured. I've spent so long believing in something that wasn't real. I don't even know who I am without it. Jason's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in Henry's voice. He understood what it was like to feel lost, to question everything you thought you knew. But he also knew that Henry was stronger than he realized. You don't have to figure it all out right now, Jason said gently. Take it one step at a time. You'll find your way again. Henry didn't respond right away, but Jason could see the faint glimmer of hope starting to return to his eyes. It was a small victory, but it was enough. As they walked back to the car, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for Henry's future. He had entered this situation as a security officer, just doing his job. But now it felt like something more. Henry had become a part of his life, and Jason wasn't going to abandon him in his time of need. While helping Henry navigate the aftermath of the scam, Jason couldn't ignore the growing sense of guilt that tugged at him. The conversations he had had with his mother, Margaret, kept replaying in his mind her quiet admissions of loneliness, her understanding of Henry's situation. Jason realized that while he had been so focused on helping Henry, he had neglected to fully address the loneliness in his own family. One evening, after another long day at the airport, Jason decided to visit his mother. He knew that they needed to talk, not just about Henry, but about the deeper issues that had been lingering between them for years. When Jason arrived at Margaret's house, she was sitting in her usual spot by the window, knitting a new scarf. She smiled warmly when she saw him, but there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Jason didn't usually visit without calling first. Jason, honey, what brings you by tonight? She asked, setting her knitting aside. Jason sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. I wanted to talk to you about something, he said softly. I've been thinking a lot about our conversations recently, about loneliness, and how hard it can be to feel like you're disconnected from the people you care about. Margaret's smile faltered slightly, and she looked down at her hands. It's just part of getting older, Jason. You learn to live with it. But you shouldn't have to, Jason said gently. I've realized that I haven't been around as much as I should be. I've been so focused on my own life, on work, I didn't see how much you needed me." Margaret's eyes filled with emotion, and she shook her head. "Oh, Jason, you don't have to feel guilty. I know you're busy, and I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden, Mom," Jason said firmly. "I just didn't realize how much I was missing. And after seeing what Henry's been through, I know how important it is to stay connected to the people we love." Margaret looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you, Jason," she whispered. "You've always had such a kind heart, and I'm grateful for every moment we spend together." Jason smiled softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm going to be around more, Mom." "Well, spend more time together, and I'll help with whatever you need. You're not alone in this." Margaret squeezed his hand, her face filled with warmth. "Thank you, honey. That means more to me than you know." Jason stayed with his mother for the rest of the evening, helping her around the house and listening to her stories about the past. It was a quiet, peaceful night, but it felt like a step in the right direction, a step toward healing not just Henry's heart, but his own family's as well. The weeks that followed the confrontation were some of the hardest Henry had ever faced. The realization that Emily had never been real still haunted him, but with Jason's support, he began to pick up the pieces of his life. There were still moments when the grief hit him hard, days when he would sit in his small apartment, staring at his phone, wondering how he could have been so easily deceived. But he no longer felt completely alone. Jason had been a constant presence in Henry's life, visiting him regularly and encouraging him to take small steps toward healing. The sting of betrayal hadn't faded, but Henry found comfort in the fact that someone truly cared about his well-being. Jason's friendship had become a lifeline for him. One afternoon, as they sat together at a small cafe near the park, Henry seemed more at ease than Jason had seen him in weeks. He even cracked a small smile when the waitress brought him his usual cup of tea. "How are you feeling today?" Jason asked, his voice light but filled with genuine concern. Henry stirred his tea absent-mindedly, then set the spoon down with a sigh. "Better, I think. I still have bad days, but it's not as dark as it used to be." Jason smiled. "That's good. It takes time, but you're making progress." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said, about reconnecting with my kids." Jason's heart lifted at the mention of it. He had been encouraging Henry to reach out to his children, to let them know that he still needed them in his life. It wasn't an easy task. Henry had grown distant from his family over the years, and the thought of mending those relationships seemed daunting. "I think it's a good idea," Jason said gently, "even if it's just a phone call to start. Let them know you're thinking about them." Henry hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "What if they don't want to hear from me?" Jason leaned forward, his voice filled with reassurance. "You won't know until you try. And even if things aren't perfect right away, it's a step toward rebuilding those connections. They're your family, Henry. They'll care." Henry stared down at his tea for a long moment, lost in thought. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time." Jason smiled, feeling a surge of pride for the old man sitting across from him. It had been a long road to this moment, but Henry was finally ready to take the first step toward healing, toward rebuilding his life, not just from the scam, but from the years of loneliness that had preceded it. That evening, Henry sat in his living room staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, his heart pounding in his chest as he debated whether to make the call. He had spent the entire day thinking about what Jason had said, and though the fear of rejection still gnawed at him, he knew that he couldn't keep living in isolation. If there was any chance of reconnecting with his children, he had to take it. With a deep breath, Henry pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then there was a click as someone picked up on the other end. "Hello!" Henry's heart skipped a beat. It was his daughter, Rachel, her voice filled with the warmth and familiarity he had missed so much. "Rachel," Henry said softly, his voice trembling. "It's me. It's Dad." There was a brief pause, and Henry's heart sank, fearing that she might hang up. But then Rachel spoke again, her tone softer now. "Dad, it's been a long time. Is everything okay?" Henry closed his eyes, feeling a rush of emotions swell inside him. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I know I haven't been around much these past few years, and I've let a lot of things come between us. but I wanted to call to see how you're doing. I miss you." There was another pause, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I've missed you too, Dad." For the next few minutes, father and daughter spoke, catching up on the years that had passed since they had last been close. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were unspoken hurts and misunderstandings that still lingered, but it was a start. By the time they hung up, Henry felt a sense of relief and hope that he hadn't felt in years. The next day, Henry called his son, Daniel, and had a similar conversation. While there were still barriers to overcome, Henry's willingness to reach out had opened the door to something new, a chance to rebuild his family relationships and mend the emotional wounds that had festered for so long. When Jason visited Henry a few days later, he could see the change in him. There was a lightness to his demeanor, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. "I talked to my kids," Henry said, smiling as he sipped his tea. "It's going to take time, but I think we're on the right track." Jason's face lit up with pride. "That's amazing, Henry. I'm really happy for you." Henry nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jason. You've been a good friend." Jason smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm just glad I could help." As the weeks passed, Henry's recovery continued. He attended therapy sessions for victims of fraud, where he met others who had gone through similar experiences. It helped him to share his story, to hear from others who understood the pain of being deceived and betrayed. Slowly but surely, Henry was rebuilding his sense of self, learning to trust again, not just in other people, but in his own judgment. But it wasn't just Henry's emotional recovery that was improving. With Jason's encouragement, he had also started to explore the idea of finding companionship again. This time, though, he approached it with caution, determined not to fall into the same trap that had ensnared him before. Jason had helped Henry set up an online dating profile, this time using reputable senior dating websites that were specifically designed for older adults looking for genuine connections. Jason had walked him through the process, teaching him how to recognize the red flags that had led to his previous heartbreak. At first, Henry had been hesitant. The idea of putting himself out there again was daunting, especially after what he had been through. But as time went on, he began to feel more confident, more willing to take a chance on love again. One evening, as Jason visited Henry for their usual cup of tea, Henry brought up the subject of dating. "I've been talking to someone online," Henry said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jason raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Really, that's great. Henry, tell me about her." Henry chuckled softly, a hint of shyness in his voice. "Her name is Linda. She's a widow, like me, and we've been chatting for a few weeks now. She seems kind, thoughtful. We haven't met in person yet, but we're planning to have coffee sometime next week." Jason's heart lifted at the news. After everything Henry had been through, hearing that he was open to meeting someone new felt like a victory. "That's amazing, Henry. I'm happy for you. Just take it slow and trust your instincts. If she's a good person, it'll feel right." Henry nodded, his smile growing. "Yeah, I think this time I'm ready." The conversation filled Jason with hope. It wasn't just about Henry finding love again. It was about his willingness to trust and believe in the possibility of happiness. The road to recovery had been long and difficult, but Henry had come through it stronger, more resilient, and with a new sense of purpose. As Jason left Henry's apartment that evening, he couldn't help but feel proud of the man he had come to care for so deeply. Henry had faced unimaginable heartbreak, but he had emerged from the darkness with a renewed sense of hope. And in helping Henry, Jason had also grown. He had learned the importance of compassion, of being present for those who needed him most. A few weeks later, on a sunny afternoon, Jason decided to visit Henry unannounced. He had been thinking about how far Henry had come, and he wanted to check in on him before his shift at the airport. As he made his way to Henry's apartment, he stopped by a florist and picked up a bouquet of fresh roses, a symbol of new beginnings. When Jason arrived at Henry's door, he knocked softly, unsure if Henry would be home. After a moment, the door opened, and Henry greeted him with a warm smile. "Jason." "What a surprise," Henry said, stepping aside to let him in. "I brought you something," Jason said, holding out the bouquet of roses. "Thought these might brighten your day." Henry's eyes softened as he took the flowers, his smile growing. "Thank you, Jason. They're beautiful." As they sat together in the living room, Henry placed the roses in a vase on the table, the vibrant red petals a stark contrast to the wilted bouquet he had once held in the airport. The sight of them filled the room with a sense of renewal, of hope reborn. "How are things going with Linda?" Jason asked, leaning back in his chair. Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "We had our coffee date last week, and it went well. We're taking things slow, but I think this could be something special." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of contentment wash over him. Henry had come so far from the man who had been sitting alone in the airport, waiting for someone who would never arrive. He had found a new sense of purpose, a new connection, and the possibility of love once again. As they sat in comfortable silence, Jason glanced over at the roses, their bright petals a symbol of the journey Henry had taken. It hadn't been easy. There had been heartbreak, betrayal, and moments of deep sorrow, but in the end, Henry had found his way back to hope. And as for Jason, he knew that this experience had changed him too. He had learned the value of compassion, of standing by someone even when the path ahead seemed dark. He had reconnected with his own family, deepening his relationship with his mother, and recognizing the importance of staying close to the people he loved. As Jason prepared to leave, he turned to Henry with a smile. "I'm proud of you, Henry. You've come a long way." Henry looked at him with gratitude, his eyes filled with warmth. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jason. You saved me." Jason shook his head, his voice filled with humility. "No, Henry, you saved yourself. I was just here to help." As Jason stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that both he and Henry had found something precious in the midst of their struggle, hope, love, and the strength to keep moving forward. As Jason left Henry's apartment, the sun casting a golden glow over the city, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He had witnessed Henry's transformation from a man trapped in despair to someone ready to embrace life again. If you've enjoyed this heartwarming story about hope and second chances, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can stay tuned for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us all of the power of kindness and resilience. And if you know someone who might need a story like this in their life, make sure to share it with them too. Linda gestured toward the door, and a moment later, Chloe Johnson, now 10 years old, walked in, followed closely by her parents, Mark and Sarah Johnson. Chloe's smile was as bright as ever, and she rushed over to Ethan, throwing her arms around him in a spontaneous hug. "Mr. King," she exclaimed, "Mom and Dad said I could come see the center." Ethan chuckled, returning the hug. "Chloe, you're always welcome here. How's school going?" Chloe beamed. "It's great. I got an A on my art project." "That's amazing," Ethan said, his heart swelling with pride for the young girl who had inspired him to change his ways all those months ago. "I'm sure it's well-deserved." As Chloe wandered off to explore the center with Linda, Mark and Sarah approached Ethan, their faces filled with warmth and gratitude. "Ethan, we just wanted to stop by and say thank you," Mark said, his voice sincere. "We've been following everything you've been doing here, and it's incredible. You've made such a difference, not just in this community, but in so many lives." Sarah nodded in agreement. "You've built something that will last, something that will continue to help people long after we're gone." "That's a real legacy, Ethan." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to their words. It wasn't the first time he had been thanked for his work, but coming from Mark and Sarah, the very people he had once wronged, it meant more than he could ever put into words. "You both gave me a second chance when you didn't have to," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I've done since then, it's because of the grace you showed me. You'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Mark smiled, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We all deserve a second chance, Ethan, and you've made the most of yours." As they stood together in the heart of the community center, surrounded by the very people whose lives had been touched by the foundation, Ethan realized just how far he had come. He had once measured his worth by his wealth, his status, and his ability to control the world around him. But now he understood that true wealth wasn't about material possessions. It was about the relationships you built, the lives you changed, and the compassion you showed to others. This was the legacy he would leave behind, a legacy of kindness, of growth, of redemption. And as Chloe's laughter echoed through the halls of the center, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had found himself. A year had passed since the opening of the new community center, and Ethan's life had taken on a new kind of rhythm, grounded in service, connection, and purpose. The foundation had grown exponentially, with new partnerships and programs reaching even more people in need. But for Ethan, the real success was seeing the lives that had been transformed by the work they were doing. One afternoon, Ethan sat in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had once been consumed by ambition, driven by the desire to climb higher and higher in the world of business. But now his ambitions had shifted. His success was no longer measured by dollars and deals, but by the smiles on the faces of the people he had helped, by the stories of resilience and triumph that filled the halls of the center. As he looked out the window, watching the community bustle with life, Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Richard Blackwell, who had recently become one of the foundation's biggest donors and had even started volunteering at the center himself. "Hey, Ethan, just wanted to let you know that we reached our fundraising goal for the scholarship program. I've got some ideas for expanding it even further. Let's talk soon." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of pride in Richard's transformation. He had once been Ethan's greatest critic, but now he was one of the Foundation's most passionate advocates. It was proof that change was possible for anyone, no matter how set in their ways they might be. As the day drew to a close, Ethan left the office and made his way to the community garden behind the Centera project that had been started by some of the families in the neighborhood. The garden was a peaceful, thriving space where people came together to grow fresh produce, share meals, and support one another. Ethan wandered through the rows of plants, his heart full of gratitude for the journey he had taken. He had once been lost in a world of arrogance and entitlement, but now he had found something far more valuable than wealth or power. He had found a sense of belonging, a purpose that went beyond himself. As he stood in the garden, watching the sun set over the city, Ethan thought about the future of the foundation, the future of the community, and the future of the people whose lives they would continue to touch. It was a future filled with hope, a future built on the lessons he had learned about compassion, humility, and grace. And for the first time in his life, Ethan King knew that he had finally found true success. As the foundation entered its second year of expansion, Ethan found himself settling into a role he had never imagined for himself: a mentor, a leader, and a champion for others. The community center had grown beyond anyone's expectations, and the ripple effect of its success was evident in every corner of the neighborhood. New businesses were opening, families were thriving, and the once neglected area was blossoming. Yet even with all the progress, Ethan knew there was still more work to be done. One afternoon, as he sat in a quiet corner of the community center's cafe, he received a text from Alex Jackson, the young man who had become one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers. "Hey, Mr. King, can we talk? I've got an idea I want to run by you." Ethan smiled as he read the message. He had watched Alex grow from a skeptical outsider to a passionate advocate for the foundation's mission. And now Alex was a key player in many of the center's initiatives. "Sure, meet me in the cafe when you have time," Ethan texted back, curious about what Alex had in mind. Not long after, Alex entered the cafe, his energy as vibrant as ever. He carried a notebook filled with scribbles and diagrams, and his eyes gleamed with excitement. "Mr. King, I've been thinking," Alex began, sliding into the seat across from Ethan. "We've done a lot of great work here, but I think there's something missing a piece that could make a huge difference." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." Alex flipped open his notebook, revealing a series of sketches and notes. "I've been talking to some of the kids who come to the center after school. A lot of them are passionate about technology, coding, gaming, robotics, but they don't have the resources to explore those interests. What if we started a tech lab, a place, where they could learn coding, build their own projects, and maybe even get involved in local tech competitions? Ethan's eyes lit up as he considered the idea. He had seen firsthand how important it was to provide opportunities for young people to explore their interests and develop new skills. A tech lab could open doors for kids in the community doors that might otherwise remain closed. "That's an incredible idea, Alex," Ethan said, genuinely impressed. "I think it could be a game changer for a lot of these kids. We'd need to figure out the logistics, but I'm all in." Alex grinned, clearly relieved by Ethan's enthusiasm. "I knew you'd like it. I've already reached out to a few people who might be able to help us get the equipment and software we need." Ethan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The tech lab could be the next big step in the Foundation's evolution. And it was exactly the kind of initiative that aligned with the Foundation's mission of empowering people through education and opportunity. "Let's set up a meeting next week," Ethan said. "We'll get Mark and Linda involved, and we can start planning how to make this happen." As they wrapped up their conversation, Ethan felt a surge of pride, not just in Alex's growth, but in the Foundation as a whole. It had become a place where people could dream big, where new ideas were embraced, and where anyone, regardless of their background, could find the support they needed to succeed. The tech lab was just the beginning. Later that evening, Ethan returned home to his modest apartment, a far cry from the luxurious penthouse he had once called home. His new space was simple, comfortable, and a reflection of the life he had built since his transformation. He no longer needed the trappings of wealth to feel fulfilled. Instead, his joy came from the work he was doing and the people he was helping. As he sat down at his desk, Ethan picked up an old framed photograph, the one he had taken from his former life. It was a picture of him standing in front of his former company's headquarters, dressed in a designer suit, his arms folded confidently as he stared into the camera. The man in the photo looked powerful, successful, and in control. But now, as Ethan looked at the image, he saw someone else, a man who had been lost, consumed by pride, and completely disconnected from what truly mattered. He had come so far since that time. The arrogance, the entitlement, the need to prove himself, it had all faded away, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. The journey hadn't been easy, and there had been moments of doubt, but every step had brought him closer to the person he was meant to be. Ethan placed the photo back on his desk, a symbol of his past and a reminder of how far he had come. His transformation hadn't been the result of one single event. It had been a process, one that had required him to confront his own flaws, to make amends for his mistakes, and to embrace the values of compassion and humility. As Ethan stared out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he thought about the people who had helped him along the way. Mark, Linda, Alex, Jordan, and even Richard. Each of them had played a role in his transformation, and each of them had shown him the power of grace. It was a lesson Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his life. The Tech Lab project gained momentum quickly. Within a few months, the Foundation had secured funding from local tech companies, and volunteers from across the city came forward to help set up the lab. The excitement from the kids was contagious. They couldn't wait to start coding, building robots, and exploring the world of technology. As the grand opening of the Tech Lab approached, Ethan found himself reflecting on his role within the Foundation. He had become a key figure in the organization's growth, but as the Foundation expanded and new leaders emerged, Ethan began to wonder if it was time to pass the torch. One afternoon, as Ethan and Mark walked through the new Tech Lab, watching volunteers install computers and set up equipment, Ethan broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Mark, I've been thinking," Ethan began, his tone thoughtful. "The Foundation is in a great place now, and with the Tech Lab and the new programs, I think it's time for me to take a step back." Mark stopped in his tracks, turning to face Ethan with a puzzled expression. "What do you mean, take a step back? You've been instrumental in everything we've done here. Why would you want to leave now?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm not leaving, not entirely. I just think it's time for the next generation to take the lead. People like Alex Thave got the passion and the vision to take the foundation even further. I want to make sure they have the space to grow into those roles. Mark studied Ethan for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I see what you're saying. You've always been good at seeing the bigger picture. Ethan smiled. I've had good teachers. Mark chuckled, clapping Ethan on the back. Well, if you're serious about stepping back, we'll have to figure out what that looks like. But I get it. You've been leading by example, and now it's time to let others lead too. As they continued their walk through the lab, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He wasn't stepping away from the foundation, he was simply transitioning into a new role, one that would allow others to rise to the occasion. He had built something lasting, and now he was ready to trust the people around him to carry it forward. The grand opening of the tech lab was a resounding success. The local media covered the event, highlighting the Foundation's commitment to providing young people with the skills they needed to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Families from all over the city attended, eager to see what the lab had to offer. As Ethan watched Alex give a speech about the importance of technology in education and the opportunities the lab would provide, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Alex had come so far, and now he was stepping into a leadership role that would shape the future of the Foundation. After the event, Alex approached Ethan, a look of determination in his eyes. Mr. King, I just want to thank you for everything. You believed in me when no one else did, and now I feel like I can really make a difference here. Ethan smiled, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder. You already are making a difference, Alex, and I couldn't be prouder of you. A few months after the grand opening of the tech lab, Ethan received an unexpected invitation or request to speak at an upcoming conference on philanthropy and community leadership. The invitation came from one of his former business rivals, someone who had once viewed Ethan's shift toward nonprofit work with skepticism, but had since come to admire the Foundation's success. At first, Ethan was hesitant. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the idea of addressing an audience full of wealthy business leaders felt daunting. But as he thought about it, he realized that this was an opportunity to share his story, to show others that change was possible, even for someone as deeply entrenched in the world of wealth and power as he had once been. When the day of the conference arrived, Ethan stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. He could hear the hum of conversation from the crowd, a mix of corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, and community advocates. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him, but he knew that this was an important step in his journey. As Ethan stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, others not, and took a deep breath. Good afternoon, Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. A few years ago, I stood where many of you stand today. I was at the top of my game, running a successful business, measuring my worth by the size of my bank account and the deals I made. But I was wrong. I was missing something important. Ethan paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. It took a moment of humiliation and a lesson in grace to show me that real success isn't about wealth or power. It's about how we treat others. He talked about the importance of second chances, of forgiveness, and of using one's resources to lift others up instead of pushing them down. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. He had shared his truth, and in doing so, he had offered others the opportunity to reflect on their own lives and the choices they were making. As he left the stage, Ethan knew that this was his final act of grace, a chance to inspire others to follow the path he had taken. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the legacy of compassion and kindness that he had helped build. Thank you for following Ethan's story, a tale of redemption, leadership, and the power of second chances. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay connected. I'm working on more heartwarming stories just like this one, and your support helps me keep sharing these meaningful journeys with you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. Together, we can continue to explore stories of transformation, hope, and the impact of kindness. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming. Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.